Welcome back to Real Talk with Susan Stone and Kristina Supler. We are full-time moms and attorneys bringing our student defense legal practice to life with real, candid conversations. Today's topic is understanding boys and their need for close connection and intimacy. You know, Kristina, when we started out our practice, we were mostly representing young men who were involved in disciplinary situations. And it wasn't until recently that I would say our statistics have evened out to a more balanced representation. But we're also the mother of boys. And I think we can both say that having both boys and girls as children and clients, boys are just as sensitive as girls. Wouldn't you think that?
Oh, absolutely. I know my son is in some ways, if we have the gender stereotypes, there's almost role reversal there, my son versus my daughter. But, you know, it's interesting at today's topic regarding boys and intimacy, because I think that through the pandemic, if there's one thing we've really honed in on, it's the fact that all humans really crave connection.
It's a really good point. And with that, why don't you introduce today's guest who's going to really speak about the topic of boys craving close connection.
Today, we're pleased to be joined by Professor Niobe Way, who is a professor of developmental psychology and the founder of the Project for the Advancement of Our Common Humanity at New York University. She's also the past president of the Society for Research on Adolescence and co-director of the Center for Research on Culture, Development, and Education at NYU. Professor Way's work focuses on the intersections of culture, context, and human development, with a particular focus on social and emotional development and how cultural ideologies influence developmental trajectories.
That was a mouthful.
That is a mouthful.
Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Way. We're pleased to have you.
So let's kick it off with your book that we read. And
Deep Secrets.
Deep Secrets by Dr. or Professor Niobe Way. The premise of your books is that boys crave close connection and that our culture stymies that development of deep friendships in the teenage years. Does that accurately summarize your book, Professor?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, I want to say thank you for having me on. This is my favorite topic. I've been wanting to engage this conversation at this point for decades. So I'm glad that's getting more attention right now, which I think we should talk about at some point. Why is it getting more attention right now? But yeah, that does summarize my book. And the thing that's interesting to me is that I have been making these observations and then interviewing boys since the late 80s, where they're telling me the same story. By now, it's sort of thousands of boys. I follow them over time. Since I'm a developmental psychologist, I follow the same boys over time. And you get the same story. I got the same story in the early 1980s as I am getting now. I follow boys in different countries, not just the United States. And I get the same story, which is that essentially they start off in early adolescence when I usually start the interviewing them about all sorts of parts of their lives, not just their friendships. I interview them about their family relationships and school, et cetera, identities. And then we get to the section on friendships and investigating friendships. And pretty much the story is same around the world, which is boys talk about at 11, 12, 13, 14, sometimes into 15 as well, their desire for close friendships, their desire for what boys call it deep secret friendships, which is they're able to share their secrets with other boys. And specifically with other boys, some of the boys we can talk about this. Some of the boys have friendships with girls, of course. That's normal too. But what's interesting to me is that boys will also say, even if they have friendships that are girls, they'll talk about wanting friendships, intimate friendships with boys in which they can share their deep secrets. And as they get older, as you mentioned, and we'll talk about it specifically in American culture, but American culture gets globalized, unfortunately, in this respect, that it's perceived now, the intimacy is perceived as so-called girly and gay. And even in a culture, and this is interesting to me, even in a culture that's becoming more open to different sexualities, it's still pathologized as being sort of gay in a homophobic way, and thus discouraged for boys, especially boys who identify as straight. And so they struggle to hold on to their friendships as they get older. And many boys, by the time they're young men, are struggling with issues of isolation and loneliness and frustration to not be able to find the friendships they have. And one thing I do want to throw out there, just so it can be part of our conversations, there's some boys who are an exception to that. And I want to talk about why I think you do get exceptions to that. It sounds like your son
What are
may
the exceptions?
Yeah,
well, that's great. Tell us about that.
So what's interesting to me is the general pattern is that sense of, as the pressures to man up happen over time through adolescence, boys start to disconnect from their feelings and sound more frustrated and angry and sad, or just disconnected rather than that sort of lovely voice of wanting deep friendships. The exceptions are the boys that are able to hold on to their friendship. And even through the 5-6 years of our studies, they are able to hold on to this close friendship, and they sound sort of consistently quite satisfied and happy in their friendships. And the key difference, and I had a student who did a dissertation on it, was that they had relationships with at least one member of their family that was very, very close. So, and typically it was their mother, and sometimes it was their sister, but it was somebody in the family in which they could really be themselves with. And that actually, this is what I want to say to all mothers and all fathers and all family members, that actually nurtures our human capacity to deeply connect to others, because you're learning the skill of it. It's getting encouraged in you. You know the skill. So when there's a problem in the friendship, you know how to deal with it. So it really was having at least one member, and typically it was the mom, who actually nurtured that kind of deep connection that allowed the boy to take those skills and use it with their friends.
Professor Way, I want to challenge you a little bit on that.
Yeah.
Because contrary to what I think a lot of people will argue, the dangers of fraternities, the pros, the good things about fraternities, and Kristina and I were just on Fraternity Foodie, the podcast.
Yep.
I will say, when we work with boys in fraternities, that they feel very intensely connected to their fraternity brothers. What do you think, Kristina?
Well, it's interesting because oftentimes I feel like in those cases, inevitably things get upside down in some respect, and relationships. I think we regularly see our male students realize that those bonds they thought they had actually weren't as deep. And when the going got tough, all of a sudden, the student, our clients, felt on an island, and it's sort of shocking. Like, I thought these were my brothers, the deepness. I mean, that's sort of what I see often.
But on the other hand, I want to challenge you. We've had, especially in certain cases, where the boys really did cry over losses together, share their feelings. And you do see boys during their college years form friendships that last a lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's why I said it was important to talk about sort of boys who are able to, I'm going to answer both of your comments. Boys who are able to hang on to their closest and their vulnerability. And it really is, in some sense, the issue you raised about thinking they're close, but they're not as close as they expected is a common thing. So oftentimes I do a lot of interviews. I do a lot of radio interviews, and I will get men calling me and say, I have lots of friendships. I don't know what you're talking about. And I'll say, okay, so first of all, that's wonderful, because it's nice to have lots of friendships. And then we'll get into conversations. Is there somebody you could go to if there's something that happens between you and your wife, or something that happens that's quite vulnerable for you? And then it'll very quickly turn into, well, no, I wouldn't talk about that. No, I wouldn't talk about that. And then it turns into, oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes into a conversation, well, it would be nice to have someone to talk about that stuff with. So the friendships that boys are really asking for in early adolescence is not the sort of bromance, the stereotypic brother, which a lot of boys want also. But oftentimes the friendships is they're really talking about those they can be very, very vulnerable with, reveal their weaknesses, talk about their insecurities with. And I find that fraternity brothers, which I've certainly interviewed lots of them, oftentimes say there's a sort of a facade of closeness that they have to have as fraternity brothers. But once you scratch the surface, many of them don't feel like they can really reveal their insecurities and their sense of that they're not quite good enough, all those feelings that most people have, especially in college context. So I think that the desire to have those sort of deep secret friendships where you can truly be vulnerable with that person and not just cry, actually, but actually reveal your insecurities with and try to work them through, I just think is what they're looking for. I say, because we're all moms of sons, it doesn't necessarily mean that they find these friends, even if they want them. So I'm saying even in early adolescence, that the theme is that boys talk about wanting them. And then you get a lot of boys, including my son, who didn't necessarily find those friendships in early adolescence and middle adolescence, and only, I would say, really found them in eventually in college. But the idea is that desire is very, very clear, and we don't think it's a desire that boys have. And I have to throw out this because it's really important. Even now, 2022, July 2022. We still have the stereotype that wanting intimacy in your friendship with same-sex intimacy where you're not gay is a girly gay thing. So you have it in a recent article in The Guardian. You have an allusion to boys and men being evolutionary different, where their evolution doesn't allow them for that intimacy. I mean, we still have these incredibly misguided false stereotypes about boys and men not wanting that intimacy.
So let me ask you, and then this issue of stereotypes. When Susan and I do a lot of work across the country with college students in the Title IX landscape, and we often represent respondents who are more often than not male. And so we come across the phrase regularly, toxic masculinity. Do you agree that toxic masculinity is a thing? Is this label justified or not? And can male students really form deep friendships, while still trying to be, quote unquote, masculine?
Or circling back to that first point that you wanted us to get to, are we in a crisis?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I have a couple of things that you can imagine. I've spent my life thinking about this, so I could go on a couple hours about this, but I'll keep it short. And of course, there's toxic masculinity. We see it in the media. We see it in our movies. We see it in our social media, which is a kind of hostile, aggressive, violent form of masculinity that is part of our culture, it's part of our war-based culture, et cetera. Gun-based. We're the country with the most guns. So we obviously have toxic masculinity. But I am arguing a slightly different argument that oftentimes gets covered over because we get absorbed with toxic masculinity. I'm actually talking about taking a very, very human quality and capacity and need, which is the need for deep connection, and giving it a gender and a sexuality. And that the way we do that is not toxic masculinity. That's called, what I'm calling in my new book it comes out in the spring, is boy culture. And boy culture with quotation, is not a real boy. It's a construction of a boy, where basically all things hard are put on top and valued, and all things soft are put on the bottom and seen as less important and as kind of lame in many cases. And in fact, as humans, as you both alluded to, as humans, we are both hard and soft. We're a yin and a yang. The hard and the soft work together with us. We're both stoic and vulnerable. We want independence and relationships. But if you live in a culture that basically privileges one over the other and demeans the soft part, everybody gets into trouble. And boys in particular, because we don't even think it's a boy thing. And so to me, it's not toxic masculinity. It really is a boy culture where we value so-called hard things over soft things. And it's so bizarre to me. I mean, it's thinking and feeling are human capacities, yet we turn thinking into masculinity and feeling into girliness.
I just want to say, and I hear what you're saying, but we are seeing and working with many more gender fluid students, both on females who identify somewhere on the spectrum and males. And actually, I'm just wondering, is it possible that all of this good research is going to get outdated as students become more gender fluid?
Well, it's a question. It's an interesting question, because I would actually argue that and I say this to my students too, who about a third of my students identify as they, is in my classrooms at NYU, is that actually I think what's happened, because we're not dealing with the root of the problem in the gender binary. It's not just a pronoun problem. It's actually a fundamental value problem, where we value the hard over the soft. That by adding another category of a pronoun is I support it, because I think you should always disrupt the gender binary, but it's not allowing us to really dig deeper. So what's happening is that the kids who identify as they are actually exploring these gender binaries it seems like in a healthy way. But what happens is people who identify with he and she, that those stereotypes are getting more and more solidified and essentialized. So if you're not, ironically, in New York City at least, if you're not a they and you identify as a she or a he, you become even more of a stereotype of a he or a she.
I hadn't thought about that. The fact that the they pronoun in some ways is polarizing or further entrenching gender stereotypes for male, female.
We have listeners who identify as they. I'm not blaming it on people who identify as they. I'm not doing that. I'm just saying when as a culture, it's a cultural problem we have. It's not an individual problem. As a culture, when we identify the problem as only a pronoun problem, but we don't go deeper, that we actually only value our hard side and not our soft side, then we do that, right, Kristina? I mean, then we create that problem of reifying the stereotypes by adding an alternative pronoun that doesn't solve the problem. It's the beginning of it's a beginning of solving it, but it's not. It doesn't get deep enough. We're a very thin culture. We treat things on the surface without going deeper, and we have to go deeper.
Let's talk about
being a thin culture.
Actually, and Professor Way in chapter 6, you talk about the label friend. And Susan and I, in our cases, we always have a component of social media and students with their friend networks and their friends from campus.
And how many friends they have. And at the same time, I mean, I even see this amongst people. Everybody's, oh, I love them. And I once challenged actually my best friend. I said, you don't really love that person. I mean, what does it mean to like? What does it mean to love? What does it mean to friend?
I mean, Professor, do you think social media has diluted the term or the label friend?
Oh, totally. I mean, this is another topic I could really go off on. I mean, everything. I mean, we continually stay on the thin of it. And the thing friend means nothing at this point. And what's interesting is that even in the New York Times, I'm going to pick on the New York Times because it keeps on reifying these stereotypes.
And I'm a Times reader every morning.
No, I know. So am I. So even in the Times, they had a piece on how many friends are necessary for good mental health. Oh my goodness. If we're not talking about that quantity matters over quality, that's another hierarchy we have. Really? As an adult, you're asking how many friends are necessary for mental health? How about the quality of your friendships? I mean, the whole point is how many friends is irrelevant. I just want to tell your listeners, a quantity does not matter.
What? Professor Ray, my father told me growing up, let's do a shout out to Dick Stone, that if you had one or two good friends, you were really lucky.
It's true.
It's true. Yeah,
it's true.
Yeah, and that's basically what the research shows. I mean, it basically shows if you have at least one person in your life that you can really rely on and really talk to and really be open with, you're lucky, as your dad said, but also that's the key to mental health, that you have to have at least one person in your life that does that. And it could be your grandmother. It could be your younger brother. It doesn't have to
be your spouse or not.
It can be your spouse. What's interesting though, Kristina, that you raised that is that I get that question a lot. The issue is that, and I say this to a lot of wives and girlfriends because they know exactly what I'm talking about. If you only have your spouse to talk about your spouse, it's not going to lead very good places. So you really do need somebody besides your spouse because the whole idea, and women always laugh when I say that. And I say, no, I'm being serious.
No, you know what? Instead of a 50% divorce rate, if every person shared every thought they had in a marriage, I assure you, it would be much higher. It would be much higher. I agree.
Absolutely.
You cannot. Everybody needs a bud that's completely independent.
Outside the home.
Outside the home.
Yeah. And in fact, I want to push it even further. In marriage counseling, I'm divorced, by the way. So I know about marriage counseling. So in marriage counseling, the advice, rather than simply being date night, it should be you guys both go out and have friendship night with another friend outside of the marriage once a week. You do that.
I do that.
You do.
I have always done that. I need my girl time.
Yeah.
You know that.
Yeah.
I agree.
I think we tend to think, especially unfortunately, I think women tend to think this more than men. We tend to think that if you don't want to always be with us, that somehow there's something wrong in the relationship. And the reality is that marriages that seem to last longer are the marriages where you have autonomy and connection, right? You have autonomy to have your own friendships And then you have connection within the marriage and with other people, obviously. But the idea is that even your husbands, though, even your boyfriends, even your partners need to have that too. And oftentimes what happens is they don't. And then it becomes a problem in the marriage because ultimately they don't have a nurturing outside of the marriage relationship, which they really need to have for the sake of the marriage. That's the key part.
Go back to the book.
Yeah.
I love that advice, by the way. I live it.
Yeah.
But, Kristina and I do this podcast, and it's really for parents.
Mm-hmm.
So based on your book, Deep Secrets, and your other book coming out, what advice do you have for parents of boys?
So basically, the basic advice is to normalize this desire. That's the basic advice. And it sounds really simple and it sounds like it wouldn't. Yeah, but I'll tell you how to do it. So I'm going to give you a story that will tell you how easy it is to do it. So I'm in a classroom. It's a class, it's all boys classroom, an all boys school. 25 boys are sitting there. They're reading that first opening paragraph in Deep Secrets where Justin, the boy in the book, says, I love him so much. I can't live without him. I don't know how to describe it. It's something I can't explain, etc. The boys all read it. They start laughing. They start cracking up. These are 12-year-old boys. They start cracking up. I know why they're laughing, but I want them to articulate. I say, why are you laughing? One boy says, the dude sounds gay. And I said, well, I don't know about the kid's sexuality, but the reality is that all teenage boys sound like this at some point in their adolescence. Most teenage boys. I didn't say all. I said most teenage boys. They're 12. And the boys all were completely silent. And I said, yeah, that's what teenage boys sound like at some point in their adolescence when they're given a safe space to talk openly. And finally, one boy said, for real? And I said, oh, yeah, for real. And then what happened is the entire classroom started wanting to talk about their own friendships. Two boys wanting to share their breakup story with each other, how they broke up because they each hurt each other's feelings. All I did, Kristina and Susan, the only thing I did is I literally just said, it's normal, right? They went from, it's not normal, this dude must be gay, to I said, it's normal, all teenage boys.
You opened the door, Dr. Way. You opened that door.
I opened the door. So the thing I would say, and this sounds like I'm promoting my work, and I'm actually not. I'm actually promoting a way to parent. Start the conversation by talking about this podcast. Start the conversation about having them listen to a part of the podcast or look at a passage in a book or look at
I like that. Yeah.
Right. And then basically saying, what do you think? Don't lecture to your son. Just say, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? Do you think that this, do you connect to this? Do you not connect to this? Have a family conversation. Don't just include your sons if you have other kids, your husband, et cetera, your partner, whoever. And the idea is that you got to implicitly and explicitly normalize it that says, this is the feelings I have. This is the feelings your dad has or someone male in your life, your grandfather, et cetera. And that, how do you feel about it? But normalize it by showing all the boys that talk like that. You know what I mean? I mean, we had it in a book party and when Deep Secrets came out, we had a really cool looking, very handsome kid, 17-year-old kid, get in front of about 200 people, and it included a soccer team. And he talked about how Deep Secrets was his story. And you could see this whole team of soccer players with their mouths open. They could not believe that some cool guy would talk about his desire for closeness and how much his friends have hurt his feelings and how hard it is when his friends hurt his feelings. And they all looked at my son and they said, is this, the same kind of question? Is this real? And my son said, yeah, my mom's been doing this forever. This is what boys, always say to her and her team. And then it opened up a conversation on the soccer team. I give talks to soccer coaches, and soccer coaches figure out ways to have these conversations with their teams. You just got to normalize it. And again, normalize also friendships, the importance of friendships. I know all you parents who are listening, you're focused more on the grades and the test scores and all those things that we worry about in terms of getting our kids into college. The reality is that if our kids are healthy, social, and emotionally, if they're having nurturing relationships, they will do beautifully in life. And it's much more predictive of all sorts of wonderful things, long-term outcomes, than it is what college you went to or what SAT score you got or what grades you got. So the idea is to really think about valuing your kids, and I'm saying this to parents, valuing your kids' academic performance and, they're sort of doing the right thing to get into the right places in their life, as much as you do their relationships and their friendships particularly, and really helping them nurture those relationships.
It sounds like at the heart of your messaging, Professor Way, is the idea that so much starts at home. I mean, what parents do to welcome their children into feelings and conversations and having opinions and nurturing that. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was such a pleasure having you.
We appreciate it.
I think that you really offered a lot of food for thought in your book, Deep Secrets. I encourage parents to check out the book and think about how to welcome and invite their own children into these conversations to form more meaningful relationships. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Way.
Okay, thank you, you too. Thank you. Wonderful, Kristina and Susan. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Real Talk with Susan and Kristina. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. And leave us a review so other people can find the content we share here. You can follow us on Instagram. Just search our handle @StoneSupler. And for more resources, visit us online at studentdefense.kjk.com. Thank you so much for being a part of our Real Talk community. We'll see you next time.